Thank you, Emma. Hello and welcome to April's edition of SEND Searchlights. The usual reminders for housekeeping first. Please do stay on mute, but if you do need any clarification on today's topic, please do pop any questions into the chat box so that we don't miss any. Any new questions can be submitted using the registration form, which will be sent to you after this webinar, along with the recording and any links to resources that we might mention. During today's session, we will be looking at different perception of neurodiversity. We'll be discussing the positives surrounding neurodiverse students rather than the challenges that they face. Many neurodivergent students do not always recognise their intrinsic talents and strengths. For example, creativity, focus, attention to detail, problem solving, etc. So today we are looking at celebrating these superpowers. I would now like to pass you over to Polly.
Thank you, Debbie. As Debbie said, we open our SEND Searchlights today with a question from one of our colleagues who asked, how can we ensure that we celebrate the superpowers that neurodiversity brings to pupils to help support self-confidence in the classroom, where often success is measured in traditional ways? So we thought actually this was a really interesting topic to explore in a time where we are much more focused on an individual's area for development and also their strengths. But I think it's important to appreciate that actually that notion of having a superpower can generate mixed feelings. So for some, it can obviously help to reframe a condition that may have been viewed negatively, actually into a positive. And using that, we develop that awareness of strengths, and then we can utilize those strengths while scaffolding and framing in those areas that need support. Interestingly, ahead of today's session, we asked friends and colleagues about their thoughts on neurodivergent superpowers, and there were so many lovely and heartwarming stories of amazing strengths and learning to understand ourselves and one another, and that's something Emma's going to go into a little bit later. But interestingly, on that flip side, while for many neurodiversity can be celebrated as having a superpower, there is also another perspective that actually, for those who view their neurodivergence as perhaps debilitating, then describing it as a superpower can sometimes almost feel patronizing. And that has been the experience for others as well. So there's a real mixture around how we describe neurodivergence and how to be positive about it. So the question is the superpower actually more about understanding yourself or another person? If you know what you're good at and you know what you're not so good at, that does equip us to be more informed, making better decisions and therefore better outcomes. Now, you can argue actually that this is true for everybody, whether you're neurodivergent or not. But I think it is particularly so for neurodivergent people, where those spikes between what they're potentially good at and not so good at might be a little bit more pronounced. Obviously, as you can imagine, there's so much information shared on social media about neurodivergence. But I was particularly struck by one post where the author described how he felt about having dyslexia, saying that dyslexia isn't a superpower or a deficit. It was more about having a poor working memory and good lateral thinking skills. So knowing, actually understanding yourself and knowing what you're struggling with and what you're good at. And they didn't feel any emotion about that, but they knew that it improved their decision making. So, for example, they knew that they needed to take notes, otherwise they'll forget things. They know that they can naturally find solutions to problems. So actually they placed themselves in an environment where they got to do that. So basically the conclusion of that is actually the framing of a condition should be up to the individual. But what we can do is help everybody by encouraging them to take a good look at what they're good at and not so good at. So I think that sums it up really well. I think we're all aware that to support any barriers to learning, we do need to have that understanding of strengths and challenges. And it's up to each individual about the choice of language as to whether any differences are a superpower or not. So I'm going to hand over Emma now to actually continue the conversation with some more interesting thoughts.
You, Polly. I think we also know, don't we, that adopting a preferred language choice is one example of the way that we can help to empower neurodiverse children and young people and their families. And of course, if you work with families who appreciate that language of superpowers, it might be of interest. There's actually a series of books written by the author Dr. Tracy Packiam-Allaway that explore the theme of SEND superpowers. And I would definitely recommend Tracy Packiam-Allaway as an author. I've read quite a few of her books actually, and she's written quite a lot of teacher-friendly books, particularly around the themes of working memory. So we'll pop a link into the chat so you can have a look at some of those books for yourself in just a little while. Anyway, back to today's topic. We often say, you'll have heard us say it many times before, and I'm sure you guys will have used similar language, that there's no one size fits all, whether we're thinking about different assessment models, different learning strategies, preferred language choices, or even those pathways to formal identification or diagnosis of needs, which are sometimes referred to as labels. And we need to be really respectful, because some families may prefer to formally define their child's need as soon as possible and to understand the potential sort of implications for that now for their child and into the future. Whereas other families may prefer to seek that formal identification later, or perhaps not even at all. And it is important that for a myriad of different reasons, we appreciate that the decision may be influenced. And so we should be respectful, we should be supportive as families pursue an approach that's right for them and for their child. I was also having a read ahead of today's session and note that, put my teeth in, Professor Amanda Kirby says labels are sometimes seen as helpful for accessing resources, and it can be helpful to use a label as part of an explanation that describes a person's challenges and may be able to help specify rather than a general sort of tag term. But equally, some people positively use it as a bridge to provide and describe the strengths that come from being a person with, let's say, dyslexia, for example. She suggests that we need to also remember, though, that not everyone wants to have a label. It's a personal decision. And I'll put a link to that particular article and another one from Peps McCree, who also discussed this very same theme very recently on LinkedIn. And so you can have a read of the research that backs up what he had to say in that regard. So if we are waiting for a learner to have a formal identification of need, what do we do to support them ahead of that? Well, of course, we meet them where they're at, because we don't necessarily need to understand what we call their set of needs in order towards meeting them. And here, if you'll indulge me, I'll use the example of my own son. During his early years in school, he found reading really challenging and would often get visibly frustrated, which made things very stressful for him and very stressful for people around him, trust me. And over time, those frustrations became more apparent when he was learning his times tables. That was another barrier, getting organised and getting his homework done and handed in on time. And he also found it increasingly challenging to sort of navigate a world where there were lots of rules and expectations and the structure of education, especially when he perceived a kind of lack of fairness or inequality towards the application of those rules. And at this stage, it could have been really easy for his teachers to describe him as naughty, awkward, disruptive, but we were really fortunate because they met him where he was at. They provided him with some support to help him develop the skills and strategies for self-regulation. They referred him to an occupational therapist to help with the organisation and the motor planning challenges that he was finding. And they facilitated the use of a laptop for him to record his learning, which was life-changing. We initially saw an understanding of his needs when he was 9, but it wasn't until he was 16 and had just finished his exams, his GCSEs, and was still using his laptop, thankfully, that we fully understood his profile of strengths and challenges. And at an arguably pivotal point in his life. He was hoping to head overseas to do his A-levels from where we were living at the time. We were all empowered, especially him, with information that helped us to really deepen our collective understanding of who he was and how he ticked. And I recently actually asked my son, as part of the preparation, who is now a political research analyst and soon to be PhD student, what he considers to be his autistic strengths or superpowers. And in his words, he says, being almost wholly programmed like a computer, although annoying when I have to deal with people who aren't, is often quite helpful. I find it helps me in academia. So I'm going to hand back to Debbie and ask her, how can we effectively meet a learner's needs while we continue to play to their strengths? And I know we've learned a lot about that over previous episodes. So Debbie, back to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Developing a strength-based approach to learning can empower neurodiverse students by keeping their focus on their capabilities and aptitude rather than their challenges. There are many ways that this can be done, and I'd like to make reference here to the Children's Society website, which is www.childrenssociety.org.uk. So one of these reasons is to ensure that schools are inclusive of all students, adapt classrooms to support learning, and ensure that devices and equipment are available for all students, guarantee the setting feels safe and secure for all students, and address the needs of individual students while contributing to their strengths. Educate both staff and students about neurodiversity and its associated strengths, to combat prejudice and to promote understanding. And lastly, recognise and celebrate all students' strengths and accomplishments. Specific praise will build both their confidence and also it will raise their self-esteem. An interesting quote from the website: society needs people that can think outside of the box and think differently. For more information on this, please do visit the website. I would now like to revisit some strategies that were mentioned in previous webinars that demonstrate playing to our strengths. Becky Howes from Cadmus Inclusive was a guest speaker at our SEND Searchlights in September 2024. And during the session, she answered this question: how can we promote an inclusive culture so that no child is left behind? Becky used the analogy of a person struggling to get a pushchair up a high curb. If the curb was dropped, it would benefit many individuals. People with pushchairs, wheelchair users, mobility scooters, etc. Not just the one person who initially had the problem. Becky suggested applying this to the classroom by adapting a vital for some, but valuable for all culture. She suggests making any additional support given available to all students so that everyone benefits and the student with special needs feels that the support is routine and not specific to them. Becky added examples such as an enable table or a help yourself shelf, where things can be put so that all students can easily access them. Another comment from Becky was to consider peer awareness so that we recognise and accept that we all learn in different ways, experience different challenges, and have different strengths, talents, and gifts. For further information, please do revisit the episode in September 2024. We were also very fortunate to have Dr. Helen Ross as a guest speaker in our January webinar. And these were some of the strategies suggested by her in answer to the following question: what are some evidence-based, practical strategies that teachers can implement to support students with dyslexia-related challenges? Helen discussed UDL universal design for learning, which is an approach to give all students equal opportunity to succeed. Making the use of technology, adaptive teaching for all, and evidence-based interventions. Again, please revisit the recording of January's edition to learn more from Dr. Helen Ross. I would like to finish with 2 quotes from Helen's book, Literacy Learning Journeys, An Educator's Guide to Dyslexia, ages 0 to 18 by Helen Ross. Work has also highlighted the importance of recognising the strengths of dyslexia so that individuals can thrive. Communication skills may be an area of strength for dyslexics. Dyslexic people think outside of the box and see the bigger picture. And importantly, communicate it to others in ways that neurotypical individuals cannot. They are creative and can express themselves well, visually and verbally. And finally, the last quote from Helen, flexibility of thinking, reasoning skills, and good spatial awareness are skills of dyslexic individuals. Dyslexic young people often have strengths in their social abilities. Empathy and resilience underpin strong emotional intelligence, which are the foundation of people management skills. I will now pass you back to Polly.
Thank you, Debbie. So many strategies there. So we hope that that will provide you with a couple of things to go away and think of, and obviously revisit all those resources available to you. So we now move on to our illuminations, where each month we do sort of sum up what we've talked about during the session and offer some useful suggestions for next steps that might be helpful to you. So just reflecting on all our thoughts for today, we would encourage you to actually think about your students in your settings, in your classroom, wherever you are, and what are their strengths? Do they approach tasks in a different way? What is working for them? And remember, sometimes these strengths may be hidden. Neurodiversity is just that, it's diverse. No 2 students are the same. I'm sure many of us in the room today have had conversations when you've mentioned a student that might have a neurodiversity of not being typically autistic, because actually they're very sociable and they can make eye contact really well. And I think thankfully we're moving away from that model. We're accepting that there are different strengths and different areas that students need support with. So just being mindful of a checklist type approach and really ensuring that we do get to know and understand each individual at a really personal level. So we would encourage you to take the time to revisit some of our previous episodes, particularly with Becky Hawes and Dr. Helen Ross, as Debbie mentioned, just for a whole wealth of those strategies. So moving ahead, looking ahead, I'm jumping ahead a bit. We've got a couple more episodes before we sort of finish for this academic year and have a bit of a break. So I just wanted to highlight our episode in a couple of months' time, which will be our last one for this year in June, last academic year, I should say, where we will be revisiting the topic of transition. So whilst we are quite early, we thought it might be helpful just to have a little reminder to start those processes now. And actually, to complement our theme for today is keeping that detailed profile of a learner's strengths, challenges and interests that evolves with them as they move through or potentially between schools. So that's a really good place to start. Then there obviously is the data to consider. Think about which data is going to be the most important for sharing at the point of transition, so that it doesn't become overwhelming. And don't forget to set time aside for those conversations to take place so that colleagues can share data, insights and context. So we will be covering more about that in June, but we thought a bit of pre-work before then, just to get you thinking about those transitions that will be starting. However, bringing us back to next month, so our May edition, our speech and language session a few episodes ago was very well attended, and we had lots of questions from that, specifically relating to EAL. So in light of that, we thought actually let's revisit that with more of a focus on EAL. So please do join us for our next session, where we are going to dig a little bit deeper into EAL and SEND. Now, just before we finish, I will just share our QR code for any feedback. We love feedback. It just helps us to make sure that we're designing our SEND searchlights so that they are useful to you. So please do scan that QR code if you're able to and provide feedback. But thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have a great day or a great evening, depending on where you are, what time zone you're in. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.